In October and November 1941, the British 8th Army formulated a secret commando attack behind enemy lines prior to Operation Crusader. It was codenamed Operation Flipper. One of the main goals was to disrupt the German organization before the start of Crusader. To reach that goal, 4 objectives were set up. The number 11 Commando was to perform a raid on Erwin Rommel's presumed headquarters at Sidi Rafah near Beda Litoria in Libya. There they were to kill or capture Erwin Rommel, the famous desert fox. A wireless station and intelligence center at Apollonia was also one of the objectives. So was the Italian headquarters and communications cable mast near Sirene. The 4th and final objective was the headquarters of the Italian Trieste division near Slonta further south. The raid came about after Captain John Hazelden, dressed up as a local, reconnoitred the area and spotted Rommel's staff car coming and leaving the villa at Beda Litoria. Acting Lieutenant Colonel Geoffrey Keyes was in command, and Lieutenant Colonel Laycock, his superior, joined in as an observer. Keyes was present throughout the planning stage, and he personally selected the most hazardous task for himself. Lieutenant Colonel Keyes was the eldest son of First World War naval hero Roger Keyes, 1st Baron Keyes, who planned and led the famous raids on Ostend and Zeebrugge. The 24-year-old Lieutenant Colonel had raiders' blood running through his veins. For Keyes himself, stakes were high as he wanted to prove himself to others, and most certainly to his own father. On the 10th of November 1941, the raid was underway. 2 submariners picked up the commandos in Alexandria. On board of the HMS Torbay was Lieutenant Colonel Keyes, Captain Campbell, Lieutenant Cook and 25 men. HMS Talisman carried Lieutenant Colonel Laycock, Captain Glennie, Lieutenant Sutherland and 25 men. Finally, by the 14th they arrived in the area, and the commander of the Torbay, Lieutenant Commander Anthony Myers, gave the green light to disembark. On the night of the 14th to 15th of November 1941, after several days at sea in the worst of conditions, Keyes' raiding party finally landed on the beach of Hesem el Helb, or the Dog's Nose. They were 400 kilometers behind enemy lines. They were guided ashore by 2-man teams of the special boat section in folding canoes. Once the raiders were ashore, Keyes made contact with Captain Hazelden, who was already on the beach. The weather turned from bad to worse, and the men on the Talisman had a much more difficult time getting ashore. One man, Lance Corporal Peter Barrant, drowning in the attempt to get on the beach. Eventually only Laycock and 7 others managed to reach the beach. Before the raid had even started, the commandos were already down from 59 to 34 men. Because of the early losses, it was decided that only 2 objectives were to be taken care of. Lieutenant Colonel Laycock remained at the beach to defend the rendezvous point. Keyes set out with 25 men for Rommel's supposed headquarters, together with 6 men under Lieutenant Cook, who were tasked to take out the communications cable mast at Sirene. Captain Hazelden and his detachment had made contact with Keyes and his men, so his task was done. He was later picked up by the long-range desert group. With the first light setting in, Keyes and his men moved to a wadi, where they stayed for the night to recharge for the next day's march. Things were about to get even worse for the raiders. Because of the appalling weather, the local guide refused to go further. So Keyes and his men had to find their objectives all by themselves. After a 30-kilometer walk in the pouring torrential rain, they finally reached their objective. They hid in a cave for the rest of the day, and by that time Lieutenant Cook and 6 men were sent towards Sirene. When the commandos under Keyes were closing in on their target, a meeting was taking place in the headquarters. Present on the first floor were Major Friedrich Barthel, Chief Engineer of Panzer Group Africa, Hauptmann Rüdiger Weitz, the Assistant Quartermaster of the Panzer Group Africa, and 2 second lieutenants. On the ground floor, the room closest to the main entry was the Waffen- und Geräteraum, the weapons and equipment room. In that room, 5 men were sleeping on the floor. There is still some debate on what happened next, but this is the most recurring story. By 10 PM on the 3rd night, being the 17th of November, Keyes' detachment crept closer. At 11:59 PM, Keyes led his men past the first sentries. Unfortunately for Keyes, they couldn't find any open windows to climb through, so drastic measures had to be taken. He ordered Captain Robin Campbell, who mastered German, to knock on the door. The captain shouted and demanded entrance. One of the guards by the name of Yamata opened the door. Keyes hesitated whether or not to kill the guard silently. Due to the hesitation, Yamata took Keyes' revolver and a small struggle ensued. Campbell opened fire, knocking down the guard, but Keyes was also caught in the fire. In the meantime, Sergeant Terry entered the weapons and equipment room. Feldwebel Kurt Lenzen forgot to cock his pistol in the chaos and was hit in the leg by Sergeant Terry's shooting. Lieutenant Kaufholz did have a loaded P-38, which was ready to fire. He popped a shot at Terry, missing the commando. Terry returned his fire on the German officer, mortally wounding him. Captain Campbell then entered the room while throwing a grenade. Alerted by the noise, Lieutenant Ampt looked downstairs and saw the body of Lieutenant Colonel Keyes in the hallway. The lieutenant retreated, and by then Sergeant Terry and Captain Campbell fell back from the weapons room so they wouldn't get hit by the grenade. Several German guards were wounded, and Oberleutnant Jäger was killed trying to escape via the window. Captain Campbell carried the body of Keyes out of the building, but he quickly realized that his commando was dead. Schutzer Matter Boxhammer was also alerted by the noise. He quickly picked up a flashlight to investigate, and in his pyjamas he ran towards the scene. But he was shot by Corporal and Interpreter Avishalom Jory. By that time the raid had already turned into a fiasco. The commandos did manage to destroy the electrical generator. Captain Campbell returned to friendly positions until he was shot in the leg by friendly fire. He passed command on to Sergeant Jack Terry, who now had to lead the 17 remaining men back to Laycock on the beach. The wounded Captain Campbell stayed behind on his own request. Things didn't go better for Lieutenant Cook at Sirini. Cook and his commando set the explosives, but for some unknown reason they failed to detonate. When they retreated back to the rendezvous at the beach, they bumped into Italian police paratroopers near the village of Mansoura on the 18th of November. The 3rd Platoon 2nd Company of the 1st Battaglione Paracadutisti Carabinieri Reali, under 2nd Lieutenant Alfredo Mercuro, first thought that they were up against some local bandits. It quickly became clear, however, that they were up against highly trained British commandos. The British withdrew to a cave and eventually surrendered to Mercuro's Italians. Lieutenant Cook's party came out of the cave. All but the lieutenant were wounded. The Italian platoon suffered 3 wounded during the firefight. Because locals had moved the foldable canoes to an unknown location, poor communication between the Torbay and Laycock, and the local patrols closing in on the beach perimeter, it proved to be impossible to re-embark on the submariners who were waiting in the bay. Knowing very well that a small force wouldn't be able to stand off a large group of Italian and German soldiers, Laycock ordered his men to scatter. All but 3 of the force was eventually captured. A patrol was sent out from the Torbay towards the beach, but Italian voices were heard on the beach and they feared for the worst. The submariner remained in the bay until November the 21st, when it shot down an aircraft before heading back to Alexandria. Lieutenant Colonel Laycock and Sergeant Jack Terry survived in the desert for 37 days until they found friendly lines. Bombardier John Brittlebank of the Special Boat Section survived for 40 days until he too was picked up by friendly British forces. The British commandos had 2 men killed, Lieutenant Colonel Keyes, who was killed in the villa, and another man drowned during the landing. The Rommel Raid was a disaster. British intelligence failed to note that Rommel had only used the villa as his headquarters for a couple of days. By the time of the raid, it had already been taken over by the chief quartermaster of the Panzergruppe Afrika, General Schleusner. Several weeks prior to Operation Flipper, Rommel had moved his headquarters closer to the battle near Tobruk. Topping it all off, Rommel wasn't even in North Africa when the raid took place. During the time of the raid, Rommel was safely in Rome asking for supplies, as a lot of the supply ships had been sunk by the British. He also spent the time in Rome with his wife as Rommel turned 50. He was back in the field on November 18th, one day after the failed attempt to kill him. It remains uncertain whether or not the objective was to kill or capture Rommel. British Ultra messages had picked up evidence that Rommel was in Rome and not his supposed headquarters in Beda Litoria. That vital evidence wasn't shown to the raiders, probably to protect Ultra. What we do know is that the raid failed. Rommel wasn't in his supposed headquarters, and even if he had been in Beda Litoria, the raiders under Keyes didn't manage to get past the front door. Only 3 men managed to escape, 2 were killed, and all the others were captured by the Germans or Italians.